The morning sun breaks over the Philippine Sea, painting the water in shades of copper and gold. Inside the ready room of the carrier Taiho, Lieutenant Warrant Officer Sakio Komatsu adjusts his leather flight helmet and studies the plotting board one final time. The intelligence officers have marked 15 American carriers operating in 3 groups southwest of Saipan. 15 flat tops. It's an impressive force, but Komatsu has flown against American carriers before. He knows what to expect. He's wrong. What awaits him and 430 of Japan's naval aviators on this June morning will shatter every assumption they hold about aerial warfare. In the span of 8 hours, American fighters will destroy 3 years of carefully cultivated Japanese naval aviation superiority. They will kill the myth of the invincible Zero fighter. They will prove with mathematical brutality that courage and tradition cannot defeat industrial might and technological supremacy. The Americans call it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The name captures the one-sided savagery of what unfolds on June 19, 1944. But it misses the deeper truth. This isn't just a battle, it's an execution. The methodical destruction of Japanese carrier aviation as a fighting force. The moment when the industrial age's arithmetic overwhelms the warrior age's spirit. Komatsu doesn't know it yet, but he's about to encounter a machine purpose-built to kill his Zero. A fighter designed by American engineers who studied every weakness, every vulnerability, every fatal flaw in Japanese aircraft and doctrine. The Grumman F6F Hellcat. And behind that fighter sits a pilot with 10 times his flight training, guided by radar systems that can see through darkness and clouds, coordinated by fighter directors who transform air defense into a precision science. This is the story of how America built a killing machine. Not just an airplane, but an entire system of technology, training, and tactics designed to achieve one goal: the total destruction of Japanese naval air power. It's the story of how democracy's arsenal, once written off as soft and inefficient, produced warriors more lethal than any samurai. And it's the story of the longest day in the short life of Japanese carrier aviation. To understand the massacre at the Philippine Sea, we must first understand how completely Japanese naval aviation dominated the Pacific in 1941 and early 1942. Their success wasn't luck. It was the product of decades of careful development, rigorous training, and technological innovation that produced the finest carrier aviation force on Earth. The Mitsubishi A6M fighter represented the culmination of Japanese naval aviation philosophy. Every design decision sacrificed durability for performance. The airframe used lightweight aluminum alloys formed into smooth, efficient shapes. No armor protected the pilot. No self-sealing layers lined the fuel tanks. The result was a fighter that could outclimb, outturn, and outrange any opponent. At 5,300 pounds empty, the Zero was a ballerina compared to chunky American fighters. It could dogfight at 200 miles per hour with controls that remained responsive when American fighters stalled and fell from the sky. Japanese pilots who flew the Zero into combat at Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies weren't rookies. They were the products of a training program that made American pre-war standards look generous. A Japanese naval aviator in 1941 required 3 years to earn his wings. He logged 500 to 700 hours of flight time before joining an operational squadron. His gunnery training included live-fire exercises against towed targets and mock dogfights against instructors who showed no mercy. Many cadets washed out. Those who succeeded formed an elite brotherhood whose skills bordered on the supernatural. Commander Minoru Genda, the tactical genius who planned the Pearl Harbor attack, developed doctrine that maximized the Zero's strengths. Japanese fighters would never attempt to trade blows with heavily armed opponents. Instead, they used superior maneuverability and energy management to dominate the turning fight. A skilled Zero pilot could loop inside any American fighter's turning radius, positioning for the killing shot before his opponent even understood what happened. The tactic required split-second timing and perfect aircraft control. But Japanese pilots trained for exactly this kind of combat. The combination proved devastating. At Pearl Harbor, Japanese naval aviation destroyed or damaged 21 American ships and 188 aircraft for the loss of just 29 planes. In the Philippines, they annihilated Douglas MacArthur's air forces in a single day. At Ceylon, they sank 2 British cruisers and the carrier Hermes while losing just 5 aircraft. Through the first 6 months of 1942, Japanese naval aviation appeared invincible. American pilots who survived encounters with Zeros described them in terms usually reserved for UFO sightings: impossibly maneuverable, supernaturally fast, flown by men who seemed to have eyes in the backs of their heads. But America was learning. Every combat engagement, every patrol report, every debriefing with surviving pilots added data points to a growing understanding of Zero capabilities and limitations. Navy and Marine Corps intelligence officers compiled detailed analyses of Japanese tactics, aircraft performance, and pilot behavior. This information flowed back to the United States, where it reached the desks of aircraft designers who understood what the data meant. The Zero could be beaten. The key lay in recognizing that the Zero's strengths came at terrible cost. That lightweight construction meant fragility. Those beautiful, responsive controls meant vulnerability. The lack of armor protection made every Zero a flying bomb waiting for a match. American pilots who scored hits on Zeros reported watching them explode or disintegrate from damage that would merely annoy an American fighter. The Japanese had built a brilliant sword, but swords shatter when struck by sledgehammers. In the summer of 1942, American forces on Guadalcanal captured a nearly intact Zero that had crash-landed in a marsh. Navy technicians carefully recovered the aircraft, shipped it to North American Aviation's facility in California, and subjected it to exhaustive testing. American test pilots flew the Zero against American fighters, exploring its flight envelope and documenting every characteristic. The tests confirmed what combat reports suggested. The Zero excelled at low-speed maneuvering, but became heavy and unresponsive above 250 miles per hour. Its roll rate, the ability to snap from one direction to another at high speeds, was poor, and its structural limits meant it couldn't follow American fighters into high-speed dives. This intelligence reached Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation on Long Island, where Chief Engineer Leroy Grumman and his team were already working on a Zero killer. They started with the F6F Wildcat, the pudgy fighter that had fought the Zero to a draw over Guadalcanal through sheer durability and pilot determination. The Wildcat survived damage that vaporized Zeros, but it was slower and less maneuverable than its opponent. Grumman engineers needed something better, a fighter that matched or exceeded the Zero's performance while maintaining American standards for protection and firepower. The result was the F6F Hellcat, and it represented a fundamentally different design philosophy than the Zero. Where Japanese engineers pursued maximum performance through minimum weight, Grumman accepted weight penalties to ensure pilot survival. The Hellcat would carry 212 pounds of armor plate protecting the pilot's seat, headrest, and floor. Every fuel tank would have self-sealing layers that expanded when punctured, preventing catastrophic fires. The windscreen would consist of 1.5 inches of laminated bulletproof glass, capable of stopping 7.7 millimeter rounds at point-blank range. To move all this weight, Grumman selected the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp engine, a massive 18-cylinder radial producing 2,000 horsepower. This engine, one of the finest aircraft power plants ever built, gave the Hellcat performance that Zero pilots would find shocking. The Hellcat climbed at 3,500 feet per minute compared to the Zero's 2,600 feet per minute. It reached 380 miles per hour in level flight, matching the Zero's speed while carrying hundreds of pounds more equipment and armor. And unlike the Zero, which became increasingly difficult to control as speed increased, the Hellcat's controls remained responsive throughout its flight envelope.
The Hellcat's armament made its role perfectly clear. This was a gun platform designed to destroy enemy aircraft through overwhelming firepower. 6.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 3 per wing, with 400 rounds per gun. Each gun fired 850 rounds per minute at a muzzle velocity of 2,900 feet per second. Do the math. That's over 100 rounds per second of armor-piercing incendiary ammunition capable of penetrating engine blocks, shredding control surfaces, and igniting fuel tanks. The ammunition supply provided 30 seconds of sustained fire, enough for multiple engagement opportunities without worrying about conservation. Compare this to the Zero's armament. Two 20mm Type 99 cannons with just 60 rounds per gun, supplemented by two 7.7mm machine guns. On paper, the cannon shells packed more explosive power per hit. In practice, the cannon's low muzzle velocity of 2,460 feet per second created severe trajectory problems. Zero pilots had to lead their targets differently for cannons versus machine guns, complicating deflection shots. Worse, the limited ammunition forced pilots to conserve fire, reducing practical rate of fire during extended engagements. And those 7.7mm machine guns? Against the Hellcat's armor, they were mosquito bites. Annoying, sometimes fatal to unprotected components, but incapable of penetrating critical areas. The Hellcat entered service in late 1943, arriving in the Pacific just as American carrier aviation completed its buildup from Pearl Harbor's ashes. The new Essex-class carriers displaced 27,000 tons each, with reinforced flight decks designed to operate heavier aircraft and survive damage that would cripple Japanese carriers. Their air groups included 36 Hellcats per ship, enough fighters to establish absolute aerial supremacy over any contested zone. By June 1944, Task Force 58 operated 15 carriers with over 900 aircraft. Japan's entire carrier force could barely muster half that number. But numbers alone don't tell the story. The Hellcat was just one component of a revolutionary system that transformed carrier air defense from desperate scrambling to precision interception. The real revolution happened in the combat information centers buried deep within American carriers. In the spring of 1944, a rectangular room deep inside USS Lexington represented the future of naval warfare. The Combat Information Center, universally called the CIC, contained radar displays, plotting boards, radio equipment, and a dozen specialists trained to transform electronic signals into tactical victories. This room, barely larger than a two-car garage, would orchestrate the destruction of Japanese naval aviation. The heart of the system was the SK Air Search Radar, a marvel of electronics that could detect aircraft at 100 miles range. The rotating antenna atop the carrier's island sent out powerful radio pulses, and the returning echoes appeared as phosphorescent blips on a circular display screen. The SM height-finding radar determined altitude within 500 feet accuracy, painting a three-dimensional picture of the air battle unfolding. Together, these systems provided what no military force in history had ever possessed: the ability to see the enemy before visual contact. But raw data was worthless without trained personnel to exploit it. The fighter director officer sat before the radar display, watching contacts develop, calculating intercept vectors, and directing defending fighters with calm precision. His voice, transmitted over VHF radio equipment, reached every Hellcat in the air with crystal clarity. Steely 23, bogies bearing 320, range 40, Angels 24. Vector headings, range to target, altitude, everything a fighter pilot needed to position for the perfect bounce. This system transformed air defense from art to science. In pre-war tactics, defending fighters maintained patrol patterns over the fleet, hoping to spot attackers through visual observation. The method was inefficient, exhausting for pilots, and ultimately unreliable. Attackers could approach from unexpected angles or altitudes, achieving surprise even against vigilant defenders. The radar-directed interception system eliminated surprise entirely. Fighter directors positioned defending aircraft at optimal intercept points, higher than incoming raids, up sun when possible, with speed advantage and positional superiority. The Japanese had nothing comparable. Their Type 21 air search radar, installed on only a few carriers, provided 60-mile detection range on good days. It couldn't determine altitude, couldn't track multiple contacts reliably, and frequently generated false returns that cluttered the display. Without height-finding capability or integrated fighter direction, Japanese combat air patrols operated independently using pre-war doctrine. They patrolled visual patterns, maintained radio silence to avoid detection, and hoped to spot attackers before bombs fell. It was the naval equivalent of fighting blind against a seeing opponent. The communications advantage compounded American superiority. The Hellcat's radio equipment provided clear, reliable voice communications even in the electromagnetic chaos of major air battles. Fighter pilots could hear their directors, coordinate with wingmen, warn each other of threats, and request assistance without garbled static, making every transmission a guessing game. This constant information flow enabled the kind of coordinated tactics that made American formations vastly more effective than their numbers suggested. Japanese radios barely functioned. The Type 96 Ku-1 radio, installed in Zeros, produced constant static, feedback, and interference. Most Zero pilots disabled their radios entirely rather than suffer the distraction during combat. They relied instead on hand signals, pre-briefed formations, and individual initiative, methods that worked fine in training but collapsed under the stress of actual combat. When formations fragmented under attack, Japanese pilots had no way to coordinate defensive responses or warn each other of threats. Each pilot fought his own battle, isolated from his wingmen, unable to call for help when American fighters positioned for the kill. The radar and radio systems were useless without pilots trained to exploit them, and here too, American superiority was overwhelming. By 1944, the U.S. Navy's aviation training program had evolved into a pilot production system that churned out competent aviators with assembly line efficiency. A prospective fighter pilot in 1944 logged 525 hours of flight time before joining an operational squadron. This included 150 hours in combat-type aircraft, 100 hours of formation flying, extensive gunnery training with camera guns recording accuracy, and advanced tactical instruction using veteran pilots as instructors. The gunnery training alone represented a revolution in aviation education. American pilots practiced deflection shooting against banner targets towed behind other aircraft. They learned to estimate range, calculate lead angles, and compress firing passes into 3-second bursts that maximized hit probability while conserving ammunition. Camera guns recorded every practice engagement, allowing instructors to review student performance and identify specific weaknesses. By the time an American pilot reached the fleet, he'd made hundreds of simulated attacks and knew exactly where to aim in every common combat scenario. Formation tactics received equal emphasis. American pilots learned to fly as sections and divisions, 2-plane and 4-plane elements that operated as coordinated units rather than collections of individuals. The section tactics developed by Commander Jimmy Thatch in 1942 formed the foundation of advanced fighter training. 2 aircraft flying abreast, separated by several hundred yards, could protect each other through mutual support. When an enemy attacked one plane, his wingmen turned into the threat, forcing the attacker to break off or face a head-on engagement. This Thatch weave negated the Zero's turning advantage while playing to American strengths in speed and firepower. Operational training units provided realistic combat preparation using experienced instructors rotating from frontline squadrons. These veterans brought combat lessons directly to students, sharing tactics that worked and identifying mistakes that killed. The training emphasized energy management, understanding that altitude, speed, and position represented stored energy that could be traded for tactical advantage. A Hellcat pilot learned to avoid low-speed turning fights where Zeros excelled, instead using dive attacks and zoom climbs to maintain energy superiority throughout engagements. The contrast with Japanese pilot training was stark, and growing starker with each passing month. In 1941, Japan's naval aviators were superbly trained professionals. By mid-1944, they were poorly trained conscripts rushed through abbreviated programs that barely qualified them to fly, much less fight. The degradation began after the Guadalcanal campaign, when 6 months of grinding attrition consumed Japan's pre-war pilot reserves. Experienced aviators died faster than training programs could replace them, forcing progressive cuts to training duration and quality. By early 1944, Japanese pilot training had collapsed into a desperate effort to produce minimal competence. A new naval aviator graduated with just 100 hours total flight time, 1/5 what American pilots received. Advanced combat training disappeared entirely as fuel shortages forced reliance on ground instruction and limited flying in obsolete training aircraft. Most pilots never fired their weapons at aerial targets before entering combat. Formation flying emphasized parade ground precision over tactical flexibility. Aerobatics, instrument flying, and night operations, all considered essential in pre-war curriculum, were eliminated. The most damaging cut was to carrier landing practice. Pre-war training required dozens of successful carrier landings before operational deployment. By 1944, pilots averaged 5 successful traps before joining operational squadrons. 5 landings. Some pilots arrived at their carriers having never made a nighttime landing or landed in rough seas. These were skills that took months to master, but Japan no longer had months to spare. They needed pilots now, ready or not, trained or not, doomed or not. The qualitative gap extended beyond flight hours to fundamental understanding of aerial combat. American pilots learned that fights were won and lost through energy management, mutual support, and exploiting aircraft strengths while avoiding weaknesses. Japanese replacement pilots learned parade ground formation flying and little else. They understood that the Zero could outturn American fighters, but not when or how to exploit that advantage. They knew they should protect each other, but lacked the tactical vocabulary to coordinate defensive responses. Most critically, they had no understanding that survival sometimes meant refusing combat, running away to preserve their aircraft and fight another day. The psychological preparation differed just as dramatically. American training emphasized that pilots were valuable assets, whose survival mattered as much as victory. Instructors taught defensive techniques, escape maneuvers, and damage assessment. They stressed that living to fight tomorrow was better than dying gloriously today. This philosophy matched American values and industrial capacity. Pilots could be trained, but it took time, so keeping them alive made economic and military sense. Japanese training emphasized the opposite. Individual life meant nothing compared to achieving the mission. Pilots who returned from missions that failed faced shame and dishonor. Better to die attacking than survive by retreating. This philosophy matched Japanese cultural values, but was militarily insane for a nation that could barely replace its losses. Every pilot killed represented not just one aircraft lost, but hundreds of hours of training investment that disappeared with his death. Japan was burning its seed corn, consuming its pilot reserves without ability to replenish them.
The industrial dimensions of pilot production revealed the fundamental asymmetry driving the Pacific War. In 1944, American flight schools graduated 10,000 naval aviators. Japan managed barely 1,000, and most of those were marginally competent at best. American training capacity grew throughout the war as new facilities opened and training aircraft became available. Japanese capacity shrank as fuel shortages, equipment losses, and instructor deaths created downward spirals. By June 1944, the quantitative gap had become a qualitative chasm. American squadrons overflowed with competent pilots eager for combat. Japanese squadrons scraped together enough warm bodies to man their aircraft, most of whom would die in their first engagement. This combination, superior aircraft, revolutionary sensors and communications, vastly better training, created conditions for the most one-sided air battle in naval history. But the battle's outcome wasn't assured through American strength alone. Japanese decisions and doctrine contributed to the catastrophe awaiting them. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the Imperial Japanese Navy's mobile fleet from his flagship, the carrier Taiho. At 52 years old, Ozawa was one of Japan's most experienced naval aviators, having commanded carriers since the 1930s. He understood carrier warfare intimately, having studied American tactics and developed countermeasures throughout his career. He also understood that the battle he was about to fight represented Japan's last strategic chance to halt the American advance toward the homeland. The strategic situation in June 1944 was desperate. American forces had seized the Marshall Islands in February, leaping 1,000 miles closer to Japan. Now they threatened the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, islands just 1,500 miles from Tokyo. B-29 bombers operating from the Marianas could reach Japan's cities and industrial centers. The Imperial General Staff designated the Marianas as Japan's absolute defense line. If they fell, strategic defeat became inevitable. Ozawa's plan relied on exploiting two perceived Japanese advantages. First, his aircraft could launch strikes from longer range than American planes, allowing him to attack while remaining outside enemy striking distance. The Zero's exceptional range, over 1,000 nautical miles with drop tanks, meant Japanese strike aircraft could hit targets 300 miles away and still return to their carriers. American aircraft supposedly maxed out at 200 miles. This range differential would let Ozawa's carriers strike first, potentially crippling American carriers before they could respond. Second, Ozawa planned to use land-based aircraft from Guam and nearby islands as additional strike forces and as refueling points for carrier aircraft. His planes could attack American carriers, land on Guam to refuel and rearm, then strike again on their return flight. This shuttle bombing concept would multiply his effective striking power. The Americans, operating far from their bases, couldn't match this flexibility. At least, that was the theory. The mobile fleet represented Japan's remaining carrier strength, 9 flat tops carrying 430 aircraft. The force included 3 fleet carriers, Taiho, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, each veterans of Japan's early victories. Shokaku and Zuikaku had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack. Taiho was Japan's newest carrier, featuring an armored flight deck designed to survive American bomb hits. 6 light carriers completed the force, smaller vessels carrying fewer aircraft but adding numbers to the striking formations. On paper, this looked formidable. In reality, the mobile fleet was a hollow shell of the force that had dominated the Pacific in 1942. The aircraft were mostly obsolete. Zeros now outclassed by American fighters, Judy dive bombers and Jill torpedo bombers that lacked the performance to survive modern air defense, and Val dive bombers that belonged in museums. More critically, the air groups contained inexperienced pilots who'd never worked together as coordinated units. Many pilots had joined their squadrons just weeks earlier. They barely knew their aircraft, didn't know their wingmen, and had never conducted the kind of complex, multi-carrier strikes that Ozawa's plan required. Ozawa understood these weaknesses but had no choice except to attack. The invasion of Saipan had already begun. Every day, American forces consolidated their beachhead made eventual victory more certain. If the mobile fleet didn't sortie now, the Marianas would fall without a fight. Better to die attacking than live having refused battle. This sentiment, deeply embedded in Japanese naval culture, condemned hundreds of young aviators to deaths they couldn't prevent and wouldn't understand. The American commanders knew the Japanese were coming. Radio intercepts and submarine sightings tracked the mobile fleet's sortie from its anchorage at Tawi-Tawi. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the Fifth Fleet, made a controversial decision. He would not seek out the Japanese carriers. Instead, his forces would remain near Saipan, protecting the invasion beachhead while letting the enemy come to him. This defensive posture ensured that American carriers would fight under ideal conditions, close to their objective, with radar providing early warning and with maximum fighter coverage over the fleet. Vice Admiral Mark Mitzer commanded Task Force 58, the carrier force that would bear the brunt of Japanese attacks. From his flagship Lexington, Mitzer could control 15 carriers organized into 4 task groups. Each group contained multiple carriers with screening cruisers and destroyers, positioned close enough for mutual support, but separated enough to avoid having all ships targeted simultaneously. The formation extended across 30 miles of ocean, a vast armada that represented American industrial might translated into flowing steel. Mitzer's fighter direction system was ready. Each carrier's CIC had been tracking aircraft movements for hours, with operators trained to distinguish friendly from hostile contacts. The fighter direction officers had studied Japanese attack patterns from previous battles, understanding how enemy formations approached and where to position defending fighters for optimal interception. They drilled their squadrons repeatedly, practicing the coordinated defense that would transform Task Force 58 into a killing ground.
The Hellcat squadrons were ready. Pilots had been briefed on Japanese aircraft recognition, tactics, and vulnerabilities. They understood they were flying superior machines with overwhelming advantages in armor, firepower, and high-speed performance. They knew to avoid turning fights and exploit their speed in hit-and-run attacks. Most importantly, they trusted their fighter directors to position them perfectly for interception. All they had to do was follow vectors, find the enemy, and employ their 650 calibers with the efficiency drilled into them through hundreds of hours of training. As June 19th dawned, the stage was set for the largest carrier battle in history. 430 Japanese aircraft would attack 905 American planes, defending 15 carriers. One side flew obsolete aircraft piloted by inadequately trained crews, guided by inferior doctrine and handicapped by poor communications and lack of radar. The other side flew purpose-built fighters directed by revolutionary radar systems, piloted by superbly trained aviators, and coordinated through crystal-clear radio networks. The outcome was never in doubt. What remained was the counting. 0730 hours, Lieutenant Warrant Officer Sakio Komatsu straps into his Zero on Taiho's flight deck. The carrier heaves through long Pacific swells, her bow rising and falling in the morning sunlight. Around him, 68 other aircraft from the first strike wave make final preparations. 45 Zeros will provide escort for 16 Judy dive bombers and 8 Jill torpedo bombers. It's a respectable force, though Komatsu notices many unfamiliar faces among the pilots. New men, fresh from training, boys really, trying to look confident in their leather helmets and flight suits. The strike coordinator briefs the pilots one final time. American carriers detected 200 miles east of Guam. Approach at 24,000 feet to avoid radar detection. Maximum surprise, maximum violence. Hit the carriers, destroy their aircraft, cripple the fleet. The words sound confident, but Komatsu notices the coordinator's hands shaking slightly as he points to the plotting board. This man flew at Midway. He knows what awaits when Japanese aircraft encounter American carriers. 0745 hours. The flag drops. Komatsu advances his throttle and releases brakes. His Zero rolls forward, gathering speed, lifting off Taiho's deck as the carrier's bow rises into a swell. 68 other aircraft follow, forming up over the fleet in ragged formations that reveal the pilot's inexperience. In 1942, Japanese formations were things of beauty, precise, disciplined, perfectly coordinated. Today's formation looks more like a training exercise gone wrong. Komatsu doesn't know it, but his formation is already being watched.
Aboard USS Yorktown, 150 miles away, radioman third class Robert Mitchell hunches over his SK radar display. At 0830, a phosphorescent blob appears on his screen at the extreme edge of detection range. Bearing 265 degrees, distance 140 miles. Mitchell keys his intercom. Contacts, many bogies, bearing 265, range 110, Angels 25. The Combat Information Center erupts into controlled chaos. The Fighter Direction Officer, Lieutenant Commander Charles Ridgway, plots the contact on his status board. 70 aircraft, perhaps more, approaching from the west at approximately 25,000 feet. He calculates intercept vectors in his head, then keys his radio to the Combat Air Patrol. All Hellcats, Vector 280, bogies bearing 265, range 110, Angels 30. Arm weapons and climb to Angels 30. 40 Hellcats respond almost simultaneously. 12 fighters from VF-1 off Yorktown, 8 from VF-2 off Hornet, and 20 from VF-15 off Essex. The fighters turn west, advancing their throttles to military power, climbing toward their assigned altitude. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines roar at full power, propelling the Hellcats upward at 3,500 feet per minute. Within 6 minutes, they've climbed from 20,000 to 30,000 feet, higher than the approaching Japanese formation. Commander David McCampbell leads VF-15's 1st Division. At 34 years old, McCampbell is older than most carrier pilots, but he's accumulated over 500 hours in Hellcats through patient, methodical practice. He doesn't think of himself as particularly gifted. He's just thorough, careful, and ruthlessly efficient. Today, those qualities will make him a legend. McCampbell's radio crackles. Steely 1-1, contacts now bearing 275, range 35, Angels 2-4. They're below you, slightly right. McCampbell peers through his bulletproof windscreen, searching the morning sky. For long seconds, he sees nothing but blue emptiness and scattered clouds. Then, almost casually, his eye catches movement far below. Small dark specks against the lighter ocean, moving east. Steely 1-1, tally-ho. Estimate 50-plus aircraft, mixed types, commencing attack. McCampbell rolls his Hellcat inverted and pulls through into a steep dive. His 3 wingmen follow instantly, maintaining formation through pure instinct. The Hellcats accelerate rapidly, building up speed energy for the engagement. 30,000 feet, 28,000 feet, 26,000 feet. Airspeed climbing past 350 miles per hour, approaching 400. At these speeds, the Hellcat handles beautifully. The controls remain crisp and responsive. The Isake engine up ahead is about to learn what high-speed combat feels like against an opponent designed for exactly this kind of fighting.
Komatsu spots the Americans too late. One moment the sky ahead is clear. The next moment 4 dark shapes are diving toward his formation from above and behind. The worst possible position. He tries to transmit a warning, but his radio produces only static. He brakes left hard, hauling his Zero into a maximum performance turn that pulls 6 Gs and threatens to black him out. Behind him, the formation dissolves as pilots scatter in every direction, abandoning their attack run before it even begins. McCampbell selects the nearest Zero and centers it in his reflector gun sight. The range closes rapidly, 400 yards, 300, 200. He opens fire with a 3-second burst, 100 rounds of .50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary ammunition, converging on a single point. The effect is catastrophic. The Zero's unarmored fuel tanks ignite instantly. The wings separate from the fuselage at the root. What was an aircraft becomes a tumbling fireball falling toward the ocean. McCampbell doesn't watch his victim die. He's already pulling up, trading speed for altitude, positioning for another attack. His wingman, Lieutenant J.G. Roy Rushing, calls out, "Leads clear. I'm engaging." Rushing dives on another Zero, whose pilot makes the fatal mistake of trying to outturn a Hellcat. The Zero pulls into a hard right turn at low speed, where its controls are light and responsive. But Rushing doesn't follow. He uses his speed advantage to pull up and over, diving back down onto the Zero from a different angle. The Japanese pilot never sees the attack that kills him.
.50 calibers converge from point-blank range. The Zero explodes. All across the sky, similar scenes repeat themselves. The 40 Hellcats dive into the Japanese formation with methodical efficiency, destroying aircraft with assembly line precision. The tactical advantage is overwhelming. The Americans attack from above, with speed, with perfect coordination. The Japanese react defensively, breaking formation, trying to survive rather than pressing their attack. Within 3 minutes, 12 Zeros fall burning into the ocean. The Judy dive bombers and Jill torpedo bombers try to continue their attack run, but without fighter escort, they're defenseless. Hellcats fall on them like wolves on wounded deer. Ensign Hiroshi Tanaka flies his Zero in a panic, trying desperately to shake the Hellcat that's been on his tail for what feels like hours, but is actually 15 seconds. He's pulling maximum G-force, his vision tunneling from oxygen deprivation, and still the American fighter stays with him. The Zero that was supposed to outturn any opponent feels heavy and sluggish at 280 miles per hour. The Hellcat shouldn't be able to keep up, but it does effortlessly, its powerful engine maintaining pursuit while the pilot waits patiently for a clear shot. The shot comes. The Hellcat's guns flash once, briefly. Tanaka feels impacts, heavy, crushing blows like someone hitting his aircraft with a sledgehammer. His instrument panel explodes in a shower of glass. Something hot and wet sprays across his face. Oil? Blood? He can't tell. The engine coughs, sputters, and dies. Smoke fills the cockpit. His last coherent thought is confusion. How did everything go wrong so fast? Aboard the Japanese carriers, radio operators listen to the one-sided slaughter with mounting horror. The transmissions are fragmentary, garbled by distance and damaged equipment, but the message is clear. The strike is being massacred. Flight deck officers who prepared aircraft for this mission stare at empty parking spots, counting the planes that won't return. Taiho's air operations officer does math in his head. 69 aircraft launched. Preliminary reports suggest fewer than half remain airborne. Of those, many are damaged and may not make it home. But the horror is just beginning. At 08:56, Admiral Ozawa launches his second wave, 128 aircraft from all available carriers. This massive strike should overwhelm any defense through sheer numbers. The pilots briefed for this mission receive updated intelligence reports about the first wave's fate, but staff officers downplay the losses. Enemy opposition was heavier than expected. The second wave will achieve better results. They're lying, of course. Everyone knows they're lying. But the mission launches anyway because refusing to launch would be shameful. The second wave flies with even less coordination than the first. Several groups become lost during the long approach flight, wandering aimlessly while consuming precious fuel. Navigation training was another casualty of the abbreviated pilot program. Young aviators who barely understood dead reckoning now attempt to navigate across hundreds of miles of featureless ocean. Some groups stumble into their targets by luck. Others never find anything except ocean. USS Lexington's radar detects the second wave at 1100 hours. The scope shows multiple groups approaching from different directions, a dispersed formation suggesting poor coordination. This actually works in the Americans' favor. Instead of one massive formation requiring concentrated defense, the Japanese arrive piecemeal, allowing American fighters to engage each group separately with local numerical superiority. Lieutenant Russell Reisner leads VF-31 2nd Division toward the nearest group, 24 aircraft approaching from the northwest. His 4 Hellcats attack from up-sun, achieving complete tactical surprise. The Japanese pilots failed to maintain proper lookout doctrine, allowing the Americans to approach undetected until opening fire. Within 90 seconds, 5 Japanese aircraft spiral toward the ocean, trailing smoke and flames. The survivors scatter in panic, abandoning their attack run. What follows is less than a battle, than a succession of execution runs. American fighter directors position Hellcats at optimal intercept points, creating layered defenses at multiple altitudes. Each Japanese formation encounters several Hellcat divisions before reaching the carriers. The attrition is progressive and merciless. A 40-plane formation is reduced to 30 by the first interception, 20 by the second, 12 by the third. The few survivors who penetrate the fighter screen face concentrated anti-aircraft fire from screening destroyers and cruisers.
Only one Japanese aircraft succeeds in launching a weapon against an American carrier, a single Jill torpedo bomber. Its pilot, showing remarkable courage or stupidity, bores through defensive fire and drops its torpedo at USS Indiana. The carrier turns hard to port, presenting its narrow stern to the weapon.
The torpedo passes harmlessly down the port side. Anti-aircraft gunners track the Jill as it limps away, riddled with holes, streaming fuel from punctured tanks. It crashes into the ocean 3 miles from the carrier. The pilot dies, never knowing his courage achieved nothing. By 11:45, the second wave is destroyed. Of 128 aircraft launched, fewer than 30 return to their carriers. Most bear significant battle damage. 1-0 lands with over 40.5 caliber holes in its airframe, the pilot wounded but alive through sheer luck. Another lands with its rudders shot away, ground looping off the carrier deck and crashing into the ocean. Shokaku's flight deck crew count their returning planes. 12 aircraft from 40 launched. 70% casualties. In any previous battle, such losses would be considered catastrophic. Today, they're merely average. The Japanese pilots who survive exhibit signs of severe psychological trauma. Young aviators who graduated training just weeks earlier describe terror and helplessness facing an enemy that seems invulnerable. Their 7.7mm machine guns appeared completely ineffective, merely sparking off American armor without causing damage. Meanwhile, American .5 calibers tore their aircraft apart with devastating efficiency. One pilot describes watching his wingman disintegrate from a 3-second burst, literally come apart in midair as if dynamited. Another pilot reports emptying his cannons at a Hellcat from point-blank range and watching the shells hit with no apparent effect. The American fighters simply absorbed the damage and continued fighting. Veteran pilots like Lieutenant Commander Kenji Suzuki struggle to comprehend the complete reversal of aerial supremacy they've experienced. Suzuki flew at Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. He accumulated over 600 hours in combat hours, making him one of the most experienced pilots in the mobile fleet. Nothing in his experience prepared him for what he encountered today. The tactical methods developed through successful campaigns throughout Asia no longer function against this new American fighter. Years of combat experience become meaningless when the enemy refuses engagement on terms where Japanese pilots excel. The psychological dimension of defeat extends beyond individual pilots to institutional cohesion and institutional confidence. The myth of the invincible zero, the foundation of Japanese naval aviation's self-image, shatters completely. For 3 years, Japanese pilots believed their aircraft and tactics were superior to anything the Americans could produce. Today proves that faith was delusion. The Americans have built a better fighter, trained better pilots, and developed better tactics. The spiritual determination and warrior tradition that Japanese commanders insisted would overcome material disadvantages prove worthless against an enemy with superior machines and superior training. Admiral Ozawa contemplates launching a third wave, but reconnaissance reports indicate American carriers maintain full combat capability. The sacrifice of additional pilots seems pointless against an enemy demonstrating overwhelming tactical and technical superiority. Yet withdrawal means abandoning the Saipan garrison and acknowledging defeat in what Japanese planners considered the decisive battle for Pacific supremacy. Cultural inability to accept defeat, warring with military reality, creates paralysis. The decision is made for him. At 12:20, USS Kavala, an American submarine stalking the mobile fleet, fires 6 torpedoes at Shokaku. 3 torpedoes strike the carrier on her starboard side. The explosions rupture aviation fuel tanks and ignite vapors from refueling operations. Shokaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor and every major carrier battle except Midway, is consumed by fire. She sinks in minutes, taking 1,200 men with her, including many of the mobile fleet's best remaining pilots. An hour later, Taiho follows her sister into the depths. Admiral Ozawa's flagship, Japan's newest and most advanced carrier, suffers catastrophic explosion from a single torpedo hit delivered by USS Albacore. Damage control errors allow aviation fuel vapors to accumulate throughout the ship. When a crew member unknowingly creates a spark, the entire vessel becomes a bomb. Taiho disintegrates in a massive explosion visible for 50 miles. Ozawa transfers his flag to a cruiser, but his carrier air groups effectively cease to exist. Two-thirds of his aircraft are destroyed, his two most important carriers are sunk, and his remaining aviators are too demoralized and disorganized for effective combat. The third and fourth Japanese waves achieve even less than the first two. Ozawa launches these strikes hoping to salvage something from the disaster, but they encounter the same layered defenses and suffer similar catastrophic losses. American fighter directors have refined their tactics throughout the morning, positioning CAP fighters with even greater precision. By 1500, the systematic destruction approaches completion. Commander McCampbell, leading VF-15's afternoon strike, encounters the fourth wave at 1445. His division of 12 Hellcats engages over 50 Japanese aircraft in a running battle lasting 25 minutes. McCampbell personally destroys 7 enemy planes, while his wingman Roy Rushing accounts for 4 additional victories. The engagement demonstrates cumulative advantages of American training as experienced pilots exploit every enemy mistake. Japanese formations dissolve into individual aircraft maneuvering defensively, abandoning their attack mission to survive overwhelming opposition.
By 1600, the Battle of the Philippine Sea's daylight phase ends. The final accounting reveals the catastrophic scale of Japanese defeat. Of 430 carrier aircraft that sortied that morning, only 130 returned to their carriers. 300 aircraft lost, 70% casualties. Worse, approximately 400 pilots are dead, including many of the mobile fleet's remaining experienced aviators. These men represented years of training investment that cannot be replaced. American losses totaled 23 aircraft in aerial combat, 23 planes against 300. The kill ratio exceeds 13-to-1 in favor of American forces. Even accounting for operational losses, aircraft crashing from mechanical failures or fuel exhaustion, the ratio remains overwhelming. The victory was so one-sided that American pilots struggled to find superlatives to describe it. Lieutenant J.G. Alexander Vrachu, who shot down 6 Japanese planes in 8 minutes, tells reporters it was just like an old-time turkey shoot back home. The nickname sticks, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The term captures both the one-sided nature of aerial combat and the mechanical efficiency of destroying Japanese aircraft. What it doesn't capture is the deeper tragedy. Hundreds of young Japanese aviators dying in obsolete aircraft, inadequately trained, poorly led, sacrificed to institutional unwillingness to acknowledge reality. They weren't cowards, they were brave men fighting an unwinnable battle with weapons and tactics 2 generations obsolete. The morning's defensive victory established American control of the airspace around Task Force 58. Now, Admiral Mitcher wanted to exploit that control by destroying the Japanese carriers before they could escape. American search aircraft had been scouring the ocean to the west, looking for the mobile fleet. At 1440, a radar-equipped Avenger located the Japanese forces 275 miles northwest of Task Force 58. The range was extreme, at the very limit of American aircraft capability. A strike at this distance would require careful fuel management, and returning aircraft would face nighttime landings with fuel tanks nearly empty. Mitcher weighed the risks against the opportunity. The mobile fleet represented Japan's last significant carrier force. Destroying it would eliminate Japanese carrier aviation as a strategic threat. He made his decision: launch everything. At 1540, 216 American aircraft launched from Task Force 58's carriers. The strike included 85 Hellcat fighters, 77 dive bombers, and 54 torpedo planes. This represented maximum effort, nearly every available aircraft committed to a single mission. The fighters would sweep aside whatever combat air patrol the Japanese maintained, then the bombers would destroy the carriers. Simple, brutal, effective. The American strike found the mobile fleet at 1840 just as the sun touched the western horizon. The Japanese had only 35 fighters remaining from over 400 that morning, barely enough to maintain minimal defensive patrols. These few survivors tried valiantly to intercept the incoming strike, but were simply overwhelmed. Hellcat pilots, veterans of the morning's turkey shoot, brushed aside the token opposition with contemptuous efficiency. The dive bombers and torpedo planes attacked without significant interference.
USS Hillyo, a light carrier, took multiple torpedo hits and sank rapidly. Zuikaku, sister ship to the sunken Shokaku and the last surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor strike, suffered severe bomb damage but remained afloat. The fleet oiler Genyo Maru exploded from bomb hits, taking with her thousands of irreplaceable fuel oil. Several other vessels suffered moderate damage. The strike achieved its objective. The mobile fleet was crippled, but the cost remained to be extracted. As American aircraft turned east toward home, pilots checked their fuel gauges and did quick calculations. Many were already below minimum fuel for the return flight. The late launch meant they'd arrive back to Task Force 58 after sunset, requiring nighttime landings, the most dangerous evolution in carrier aviation. The return flight became an ordeal. Aircraft ran out of fuel one by one, forcing pilots to ditch in the ocean. Some pilots transmitted position reports before hitting the water, giving rescuers a chance to find them. Others simply disappeared into the darkness, never to be seen again. The ocean below was empty, vast, and utterly indifferent to human survival. At 8:30, the first aircraft reached Task Force 58. The carriers were completely dark, normal procedure to avoid submarine detection. Pilots circled in the darkness, fuel gauges reading empty, engines beginning to sputter. Some pilots prepared to ditch near the destroyers, hoping to be rescued. Then Admiral Mitcher made a decision that would become legendary in naval aviation. "Turn on the lights," he ordered. Every searchlight, every flight deck light, every signal lamp on every ship in Task Force 58 blazed to life. The dark ocean transformed into a field of lights stretching for miles. Mitcher accepted the risk of submarine attack, prioritizing pilot recovery over ship safety. The message was clear. America valued its pilots more than its admirals feared torpedoes. The landings were chaotic. Pilots, exhausted and low on fuel, attempted night landings they'd barely practiced. Some made successful traps on their first try. Others crashed into the barriers, damaging aircraft but surviving. Several aircraft crashed into the ocean near the carriers, their pilots ejecting at the last moment and swimming toward the lights. Destroyers picked through the water, rescuing pilots floating in their life jackets. The recovery effort continued to dawn. The final tally: 80 aircraft lost in the evening strike, mostly to fuel exhaustion and landing accidents, but 85% of aircrew survived, rescued by the destroyer screen and the carrier's swift rescue boats. The recovery rate demonstrated American commitment to preserving trained pilots. Japan would never have conducted such a rescue operation. Japanese doctrine accepted pilot losses as inevitable. Warriors who failed to return from missions had dishonored themselves through defeat. America valued every trained pilot as a scarce resource requiring protection.
June 20th dawned over an ocean littered with wreckage. Oil slicks marked where Japanese ships had died. Life rafts dotted the water carrying survivors from ditched American aircraft. Task Force 58 continued rescue operations throughout the morning, pulling exhausted pilots from the water. Many had spent the night floating in their life jackets, watching phosphorescent plankton glow around them and wondering if rescue would come. For most, it did. The Japanese mobile fleet retreated westward at maximum speed, abandoning any hope of interfering with the Saipan invasion. Admiral Ozawa's report to Combined Fleet Headquarters acknowledged catastrophic defeat. The carrier force that sorted with 430 aircraft now possessed fewer than 35 operational planes. The pilots who remained were too demoralized and disorganized for effective combat. The mobile fleet had effectively ceased to exist as an offensive force. The strategic implications became apparent immediately. Without carrier aviation, Japan could not contest American advances in the Central Pacific. The Marianas would fall, giving the U.S. air bases within B-29 range of Japan's home islands. Subsequent operations against the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa would proceed without meaningful interference from Japanese carriers. The Imperial Navy that had dominated the Pacific in 1942 was relegated to desperate defensive operations, ultimately culminating in suicide attacks as the only way to inflict casualties on American forces.
The Battle of the Philippine Sea demonstrated that modern industrial warfare rewards technological superiority and systematic training over warrior tradition and spiritual determination. Japanese naval aviation built its reputation on superior aircraft and extensively trained pilots, achieving decisive victories throughout 1941 to 1942. The Zero fighter dominated every opponent through exceptional maneuverability and range. Pilots accumulated combat experience across multiple campaigns, developing tactics that maximized their advantages. This combination created psychological supremacy where Allied pilots entered combat expecting defeat. The Hellcat's introduction reversed this dynamic completely through purpose-built design specifically countering Japanese strengths. American designers accepted weight penalties for armor and self-sealing tanks, creating aircraft that survived damage that destroyed Zeros instantly. The powerful R-2800 engine provided performance margins allowing pilots to dictate engagement terms while avoiding situations where Zeros excelled. The massive firepower of 6.5 caliber guns overwhelmed Japanese aircraft structures designed for minimum weight rather than battle damage resistance. The radar-directed fighter control system exemplified technological force multiplication beyond individual aircraft capabilities. The ability to position fighters optimally before visual contact negated Japanese tactical surprise while maximizing defensive efficiency. This systematic approach to aerial defense transformed carrier task forces from vulnerable targets into nearly impregnable fortresses against conventional air attack. The integration of sensors, communications, and command functions created synergistic capabilities exceeding the sum of individual components. American training systems expansion demonstrated industrial-age warfare's triumph over craftsman tradition. While Japan struggled to train hundreds of replacement pilots using abbreviated programs, America trained thousands using systematic curriculum developed through operational analysis. The assembly line approach to pilot production achieved consistent quality through standardized instruction and extensive flying hours. Each American pilot represented an interchangeable component in the naval aviation system rather than an irreplaceable individual whose loss crippled unit effectiveness. The human cost extended beyond aircraft and pilots to institutional knowledge accumulated through years of training and combat experience. Japan's pre-war naval aviators represented an elite cadre of skills which required extensive development through rigorous selection and training. Their loss could not be replaced with abbreviated wartime programs that produced pilots with minimal competence rather than excellence. The qualitative decline became self-reinforcing as inexperienced pilots suffered disproportionate losses, further degrading overall force effectiveness. The psychological impact of defeat devastated Japanese naval aviation morale. For 3 years, pilots believed their aircraft, tactics, and training were superior to anything Americans could produce. June 19th shattered that faith completely. The spiritual determination and warrior tradition that commanders insisted would overcome material disadvantages proved worthless against machines, superior training, and superior technology. The cognitive dissonance between cultural values and military reality created institutional paralysis. How could Japan's warriors lose to American democracy when Bushido demanded victory through superior spirit? The answer, of course, was that spirit matters little against machine guns. Courage cannot defeat radar. Honor does not protect against .5 caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds. The Battle of the Philippine Sea proved these truths with mathematical brutality. 300 Japanese aircraft destroyed against 23 American losses represented more than tactical defeat. It represented the complete obsolescence of Japanese naval doctrine, training, and aircraft design.
American industrial superiority ultimately proved decisive through quantity and quality advantages that overwhelmed Japanese forces, regardless of tactical innovation or individual courage. The ability to produce thousands of aircraft monthly while training pilots to operate them effectively created insurmountable numerical superiority. Each American loss could be replaced multiple times, while Japanese losses represented permanent degradation of combat capability. The production statistics revealed the hopelessness of Japan's position. America produced 96,000 aircraft in 1944, while Japan managed only 28,000, despite total national mobilization. The Hellcat alone achieved a kill ratio of 19-1, accounting for 75% of all Navy aerial victories despite entering service halfway through the war. This validated the design philosophy prioritizing pilot survivability through protection systems, overwhelming firepower, and performance margins that allow pilots to dictate engagement terms. Veterans consistently praised the Hellcat's forgiving flight characteristics and ability to absorb battle damage while maintaining combat effectiveness. Unlike the Zero, which demanded perfection from pilots and punished mistakes with death, the Hellcat forgave errors while delivering devastating offensive capability. This design philosophy matched human values about human life's worth and produced practical combat superiority. Japanese naval aviation never recovered from the Marianas disaster. The kamikaze phenomenon emerged from desperate attempts to offset conventional inferiority through suicide attacks. Young pilots with barely 40 hours flight time were loaded into bomb-laden aircraft and pointed at American ships. Their sacrifice achieved minimal strategic impact while consuming Japan's remaining pilot reserves. The institutional knowledge accumulated through decades of development disappeared not through glorious defeat in battle, but through bureaucratic refusal to acknowledge reality until too late. The Battle of the Philippine Sea marked the end of carrier aviation as balanced competition between opposing forces with complementary advantages. American technological and training superiority created conditions where combat became execution rather than contest, with outcomes determined before engagement began. The Japanese pilots who launched on June 19th flew into predetermined destruction, lacking realistic capability to achieve objectives against prepared American defenses. The strategic consequences extended beyond immediate military defeat to fundamental reassessment of warfare's nature in the industrial age. Japan's military leadership confronted reality that their nation lacked resources to compete with American production capability regardless of tactical innovation. The decision to continue fighting despite mathematical certainty of defeat reflected cultural inability to accept surrender rather than rational strategic calculation. The technological revolution in naval warfare demonstrated at the Philippine Sea influenced post-war aviation development worldwide. The integration of radar, communications, and fighter control established patterns followed by every major navy seeking carrier aviation capability. The emphasis on pilot survivability through aircraft protection and systematic training became standard practice, replacing pre-war acceptance of attrition. The Battle of the Philippine Sea represented the culmination of American naval aviation development from Pearl Harbor's disaster through methodical construction of overwhelming superiority. The carrier task forces that Japan attacked in 1941, hoping to eliminate American Pacific presence, returned multiplied tenfold with superior aircraft, pilots, and tactical doctrine. The transformation from desperate defense to offensive supremacy occurred through systematic application of industrial resources, technological innovation, and operational analysis. The individual pilot experiences revealed human dimensions beyond statistical abstractions of victory and defeat. American pilots described the surreal experience of shooting down multiple enemy aircraft with minimal effort while feeling sympathy for opponents flying obsolete aircraft with inadequate training. Japanese survivors recounted horror of watching squadron mates destroyed without opportunity for effective resistance against enemies that seemed invulnerable.
These personal narratives captured warfare's essential tragedy, where technological superiority translated into human suffering regardless of individual courage or determination. Young Japanese aviators who dreamed of glory defending their homeland instead died in obsolete aircraft, overwhelmed by enemies they couldn't effectively engage. Their sacrifice achieved nothing beyond demonstrating American superiority while depleting Japan's remaining aviator reserves. The Marianas turkey shoot entered aviation history as demonstration of American aerial supremacy achieved through systematic superiority in training, technology, and tactical doctrine. The battle proved that modern warfare rewards industrial capability and scientific advancement over warrior tradition and spiritual determination. Japan's attempt to achieve decisive victory through conventional carrier aviation ended in catastrophic defeat that eliminated their naval aviation as effective force.
300 aircraft destroyed in a single day. 400 pilots killed. 2 fleet carriers sunk. The mathematics of June 19, 1944 tell the story with brutal simplicity. American industrial might and technological innovation decisively defeated Japanese warrior tradition and spiritual determination. The Battle of the Philippine Sea wasn't just a tactical victory. It was proof that in modern industrial warfare, the side with better machines, better training, and better systems will defeat the side with greater courage when that courage isn't backed by equal technology. The F6F Hellcat served as the principal instrument of this destruction. Grumman's engineers had studied Japanese aircraft and tactics, identified every weakness, and designed a fighter specifically to exploit those vulnerabilities. Heavy armor defeated Japanese light machine guns. Powerful engines maintained energy superiority throughout engagements. Massive firepower destroyed fragile Zeros with minimal ammunition expenditure. The Hellcat wasn't the fastest fighter or the most maneuverable. It was simply the most effective killing machine for its specific tactical environment. But the Hellcat alone couldn't have achieved the turkey shoot without the radar-directed fighter control system that positioned American fighters optimally for every interception. The revolution in air defense transformed carrier task forces from collections of vulnerable ships into integrated defensive systems that detected enemies at 100 miles, calculated perfect intercept vectors, and coordinated dozens of fighters through clear radio communications. Japanese pilots flew into a buzzsaw, encountering layered defenses at multiple altitudes, with American fighters positioned above them, faster than them, and guided by controllers who saw the entire battle unfolding on radar screens. The training differential proved equally decisive. American pilots with 525 hours flight experience, extensive gunnery training, and systematic tactical instruction faced Japanese replacements with 100 hours total time, minimal weapons training, and virtually no combat preparation. The mismatch was so severe that many Japanese pilots died without understanding what killed them, shot down by enemies they never saw, outmaneuvered in ways their training never prepared them for, overwhelmed by firepower they couldn't match. The institutional implications extended beyond immediate battle results to Japan's complete inability to rebuild carrier aviation before war's end. The pilots lost on June 19th represented years of training investment, human capital that couldn't be replaced through abbreviated wartime programs. Each death degraded overall force quality, creating downward spirals where increasingly inexperienced pilots suffered disproportionate losses in subsequent operations. By war's end, Japanese naval aviation had been reduced to kamikaze attacks, the only tactic remaining when conventional combat became impossible. The Battle of the Philippine Sea stands as testament to American industrial democracy's capacity for military regeneration when facing existential threats. The nation attacked at Pearl Harbor rebuilt its shattered Pacific Fleet within 3 years, producing not just more ships, but better ships, not just more pilots, but better pilots, not just more aircraft, but vastly superior aircraft. This transformation occurred through methodical application of engineering talent, industrial capacity, and systematic training. Advantages that authoritarian Japan couldn't match despite total national mobilization. Lieutenant Warrant Officer Sakio Komatsu never returned from his mission on June 19th. His Zero, like 300 others that morning, was destroyed by American fighters he couldn't outmaneuver, couldn't outshoot, and couldn't escape. He died courageously, as his training demanded, attacking an enemy against impossible odds. His sacrifice achieved nothing beyond adding one more kill mark to an American pilot's scorecard. His death proved what Japanese commanders refused to acknowledge, that modern war is won in factories and training schools, not through warrior spirit alone. The F6F Hellcat that killed Komatsu and hundreds like him proved democracy could build weapons as effective as tyrannies could build, train pilots as skilled as totalitarianism could, and fight with determination matching any authoritarian regime. More than that, it proved free nations that value individual life paradoxically produce more effective warriors than societies that treat humans as expendable resources. The American pilot who shot down Komatsu survived the war, trained the next generation of naval aviators, and lived to see his grandchildren. His survival mattered to his family, to his community, and to his nation. Japanese doctrine considered survival shameful. American doctrine made it a priority. 70 years later, we remember the Battle of the Philippine Sea not as the Marianas turkey shoot, though that name captures the one-sided nature of combat, but as the moment modern industrial warfare's arithmetic overwhelmed traditional military virtues. Courage, honor, and fighting spirit remain important, but they cannot defeat radar, armor, systematic training, and overwhelming firepower. The young men who died in obsolete aircraft on June 19, 1944, were brave. They were also doomed. Sacrificed to institutional refusal to acknowledge technological and industrial inferiority. The F6F Hellcat was the machine that killed Japanese naval aviation. But it was more than just an airplane. It was a system: radar, radio, training, tactics, and industrial might, purpose-built to achieve one goal: the complete destruction of enemy air power. That system succeeded with brutal efficiency, proving that in modern war, the nation that best harnesses technology, industry, and human talent will defeat opponents regardless of their warrior traditions. The sun set over the Philippine Sea on June 19, 1944. Illuminating wreckage and oil slicks stretching for miles. 300 Japanese aircraft lay shattered beneath the waves. 400 pilots would never see another sunrise. The myth of the invincible Zero died with them, replaced by American technological supremacy that would dominate the Pacific for the war's duration.
The machine gun cruiser USS Helena proved one thing: determination alone wins battles. The F6F Hellcat proved something different.
In modern industrial war, superior technology, training, and systems defeat determination when that determination isn't matched by equal capability. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was inevitable from the moment American engineers designed the Hellcat and American training programs produced pilots who could fully exploit its advantages. What happened on June 19th wasn't a battle, it was arithmetic, and the math was never in doubt.